Okay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Liam Bright. So our strategy when we put together our roster of talks for these events is that we try to mix both argumentation theorists who would be familiar to an audience of people working in argumentation theory with other people who are perhaps not familiar to argumentation theories but really should be. So Liam is someone who works in a variety of areas which are at least kind of argumentation adjacent, so notably social epistemology, but he also has a background in Bayesian reasoning, formal methods, and he's increasingly well cited in these areas. He's also perhaps familiar to many people as one of the sort of stalwarts of philosophy Twitter. I think he's not quite well. There are more followed accounts, and there are accounts more followed by philosophers, but there are very few accounts that have both more total followers and more philosophy followers. I think Nigel Warburton, and that's it. So he is an unavoidable figure, and has perhaps in that capacity done more to publicize the Leverhulme Prize than anyone alive. So having given him this introduction, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Liam Kofi Bright, who will be talking on There Will Be No Message Discipline.
Thank you for that just incredibly humiliating introduction. Hi, yes, I'm here today to speak about a kind of argument which I see deployed where people are sort of trying to give what I'm going to say sort of instrumental arguments for a certain kind of message discipline, or it's often like somewhat ethical in nature, the argument they're giving. So I thought it just seemed appropriate for this talk. But I should say, more generally, I am interested in argumentation theory, although I'm not someone who you said that people should pay attention to. I don't think I've done anything in argumentation theory, but I'm interested in it as an outsider, so I'm really happy to get to talk to people and get to know them here. So let's get going. This is a talk about a phenomenon which first became salient to me on the internet. I mean, some of you may have heard of the internet. It's a sort of trendy thing nowadays. And on this series of tubes, people have been known to get in arguments on occasion. And I'm on Twitter, which is one such venue where such arguments regretfully occur. And I became very fascinated by sort of two features of this, which eventually prompted a blog post, which is the inspiration for this talk, but which I'm sure aren't limited to the internet, but which is where that first became apparent to me. And that is, firstly, this kind of forever war feature of it. So this is actually an image from a comic called The Forever War. And there's this element of it sort of like where, there's different arguments all the time, and yet somehow it's always the same argument. There's broadly recognizable themes that prop up over and over again, and they're arguing about ostensibly different topics, but somehow it all feels like the same kind of argument, even when there isn't necessarily an immediate logical or theoretical link between the things argued. So, if today we're arguing about somebody who was shot by the police and it was filmed and it seems unfair, and then tomorrow we're arguing about a school which is going to have drag queens read stories to children in like sort of after school hours club activity. And like there's nothing really connecting those issues, but we'll be like, it's a very familiar sort of feature of polarization and cultural conflict, that it'll be this kind of recognizable, the two teams will keep fighting about these things. And it seems to go on forever. And it's not only that there's this recognizable teams which persist despite the change of issues, but it doesn't seem to even be any sort of like any such thing as winning it. It's not really clear what winning this war would amount to. So this inspired a few things. First, I wrote a paper, which I guess I should have linked beforehand, but this was as it pertained to race in particular. This is called, I called it White Psychodrama. And that was about how this this forever war, this culture war takes place with regard to race issues in particular. But this talk is on the same topic, but like on a different feature of it, which is this really common move I see pundits make where they're frustrated at the excesses of people that are on their own teams. This is an argument people adopt, but ostensibly not aimed at persuading the other side, but aimed at sort of disciplining the proponents of whatever they take their side to be. Now, the examples I'm familiar with are usually sort of left liberal types, because that tends to be who's haranguing academics in this way. But I don't think it's limited to left liberal types. That's just the examples I'm most familiar with. So that's what I'll give. Here's just a collection of almost all of these headlines from newspapers. One of them is actually a Quora post, but the other headlines from newspapers, in fact, the New York Times opinion guest essay, which is the My Liberal Campus one in the bottom there, that's actually just from 2 days ago, a day ago, like very recently. So these are coming up again and again. Where what they have in common, I'm not sure if that's broken, where what they have in common is this idea that somehow the people who are like vocally on my team are talking in annoying ways. They're too extreme. They alienate people. They have a kind of a way of approaching things which is sort of like counterproductive. And so and I want to note that the New York Times one is actually talking about on campuses. So this is not necessarily online. This can be in physical space. Although personally, I actually suspect that you'd find that even when they say on campus, what they mean are online spaces where recognizably everyone is like a participant in a particular community. So even when it's offline, I suspect there is an online relationship. But anyway, the point is, these are all this kind of thing, but they're directed to the same kind of forever war teams, and they are sort of trying to discipline their team in order to get them to behave in a way which isn't going to create a backlash or alienate potential allies or fracture the team or just not be comprehensible to people or push people towards the other team or so on and so forth. So this is you see this move all the time. It's a common source of newspaper op-eds and things like that. And this, it just puzzled me. I mean, it puzzled me, and I think it's quite mistaken. I mean, the title's, it's not a murder mystery. I'm not trying to sort of trick you into it. I think I really don't think this kind of argument is going to get anywhere, and I'm going to be pretty brusque with it. I think the mistake is kind of basic. So, but I'm gonna. So I don't mean it to be anything fancy in my sort of analysis of what went wrong here. So hopefully after I can go through that reasonably quickly, we can spend a Q&A discussing it. And I'd be interested kind of like from an ethical point of view, because I think insofar as these people, these pundits who make these arguments are being sincere, which isn't always a given, but when they are being sincere, often I think that there is a kind of ethical underpinning to what they're saying, where they think this is something like a matter of self-indulgence versus the public good. And what's happening is that people are choosing self-indulgence over the public good, and that's what's a mistake. Whereas, as will become apparent, I simply don't think that's an issue here. So, I think this is sort of part of an ethics of argumentation, where there's a sort of model of the ideal cultural participant is this sort of like austere, sort of stoical warrior for the team who sort of in quite intimate ways in their sort of their personal life, their after work Facebook posts or whatever, is still sort of molding their character and their persona to be the kind of person who will ultimately secure victory for the team. And I find that pretty interesting, given that I think the stakes are quite unclear and what winning means is even unclear. Okay, so that's the sort of the big thing which inspired this. I don't really know how familiar this kind of online culture war is, but I guess if you know me on Twitter, you are presumably so very online that this will be recognizable to you, and then I'm so sorry. But if you're not familiar, then hopefully as we go through, I'll keep verbally giving examples, and it'll gradually become familiar. Okay, so let's do this. So, I think the basic issue here is one which is sometimes discussed in social epistemology as like a bad company. where, you know, the problem is like the very act of being seen with these people is discrediting. No one can take you seriously if behind you, well, there's the murder chap or whatever. But you know, this is a general problem people worry about. And so when I see it discussed, though, what they often is often discussed in terms of, if I find myself in bad company, how should I respond, right? So here's something like, I've got an opinion on climate change. I look around at all the other people who share my opinion seem to me to be cranks on other issues which I'm aware of. Should that make me revise my opinion on climate change? Or other times, like, I've got an opinion on climate change. If I utter this opinion, I know that the people who make use of it are people I view to be cranks or deceptive. Does that impose on me some duty to either change my opinion or at least hold my tongue? These are definitely related to the issue, but in both of those cases, like, the sort of worry about the bad company is people who sort of are otherwise opposed to me in some sense. Whereas I think the interesting thing here is that all of these arguments from the previous slide, all of these people still kind of like ultimately see themselves as on the same side as the people they nonetheless view to be bad company. And so it's kind of another thing which I think this is kind of interesting, as opposed to the typical discussions in social epistemology about bad company problems, is that it tells us something about like how people are perceiving their polarized identities, like what it is they think makes someone on their team. Like, this seems like an ideological battle, and yet I can think you are a crank and have sort of bad ideology tendencies and still think you're my team and so worth correcting. And so this, I think it's also kind of, it's studying this is interesting and telling us about what people think they're doing when they engage in these fights. So yeah, that's another reason I think this is interesting. Okay. So, like, you know, the basic maneuver here is to sort of, you know, we'll be having some argument. This is give one of the examples, and we'll be talking about, say, let's give an example. Somebody has been assaulted by the police. It was caught on camera, and it looks pretty obviously to be an injustice. And so I am trying to argue some people into the position that we should regulate the cops more. We should, I don't know, have more independent oversight, or make them wear cameras that would expose them to more oversight and regulation, or so on. And I'm making this argument, and then someone comes along and they're on my team and they sort of argue against the same people I'm arguing against. But what they say is we should fire all the cops and replace them with people's who have PhDs in literary theory, who should like read slam poetry of criminals until they realize that, you know, what they're doing is wrong. And then that sort of just means the whole argument now becomes mocking that person, and everyone piling on saying how silly these leftists are, because everyone knows slam poetry is kind of boring. And so, you know, nothing gets done now. And, you know, then I feel this frustration. I'm like, I think I had a pretty good case here. I think, you know, the evidence we were discussing before was kind of slam dunk, and I could have moved people towards a position that would have been for the good. In fact, that me and the slam poetry person both agree is to the good. And yet they came in with their wacky opinions, and you know, now the other team are winning. And couldn't they just have been cool? Can't they just be cool? Why can't you just be cool? And if you're on the internet, I'm sure this kind of scenario will be very familiar to you. Like, just this, why can't you be normal, please? I'm begging you, is a thing you often find yourself thinking when engaging with people on the internet, and sometimes actually philosophers. So maybe it's familiar even if you're not on the internet. But like, it's like a very sort of common feeling one has, and I think what's going on is people are giving frustration to that. But the answer, like, just has to be no, right? Like, and in what we're going to see is people aren't, when you have that feeling of like, why can't you be cool? People aren't really thinking about the stakes correctly. The thing I just said, the little internal monologue, was me trying to get into the head of people making the argument of like, sort of, oh, I was winning. If only you hadn't have done this, things would have been different. I just think you have to realize that's deeply not true. That's not how internet dialogue works. It's not how argumentation on the internet works. It's really not how the back and forth of ideas being exchanged tends to produce reactions. And so what I think people need to do is like come to a better understanding of their actual place and role in this activity, or like the nature of the activity, maybe they're engaging better. So that sort of that feeling that you will find welling up, saying, why can't you just be cool? This is all going well. You just have to learn to, I want to sort of provide an error theory of that feeling. Like that's where I think people are going wrong. So to explain that, like I just got a just give my, a quick picture of my model of the world. So this, very rough, and I myself might even be an edge case for this very taxonomy, but very rough. You can divide personas on these kind of online spaces into people who are sort of influencers, who have a big audience, who get to tend to set the terms of the discussion of the day, around whom people will rally and often form parasocial relations. That's often a key feature of these influence. And then there's like, random schmucks, which is, everyone else. There's a sort of a large class of people who they're not that well followed. People don't really see them as thought leaders or as representative of a team or anything like that. They're just, ordinary denizens of the internet posting into the void. And it's important that, almost all of us, my audience, you guys, and probably me too, even if I am second only to Nigel Warburton, which that's going to haunt my dreams, by the way. But, we're probably all schmucks, right? Like we're probably not the kind of people who actually set the social agenda. We're just posters. We're just random people saying all sorts of random things, and it's important that that's who the audience is. That's who I'm talking to now. That's who I'm addressing these arguments to. But also importantly, for those opinion pieces I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of their audience are also in this class of schmucks. This is ordinary people, like the proletariat masses doing an honest day's labor in the posting mines, right? Like that's who we are, and that makes a difference. And in fact, one of the things I'm going to have in the error theory is I think people kind of forget this in a certain kind of strange way when they reason about these things. But okay, so having established I'm a schmuck talking to other schmucks. Here's my very, very simple, nothing fancy, sort of model of like what is involved in being a schmuck. So here's the sort of like in more detail what I think is relevant about this kind of person. So we're going to assume that this person is like sincere, that this person is engaging in this forever war, this cultural battle, because they actually care about their principles and they want them to win out, and they're hoping to persuade people or at least sort of move people in the right direction. Now that's, it's obviously generous. Some people are trolls, some people don't take things too seriously, but let's assume that the sort of the average schmuck is sincere as far as these things go. Let's also assume that no one likes being muzzled, right? So just they have a mild preference for speaking their mind rather than having sort of being message discipline types. That no one signed up to, not being paid to be consultants by a political party or be spokespeople. They really are just randos, just online, politically engaged, but not operatives or something like that. And so while, they understand that most of all it's important their principles win out, all else equal, they do want to be able to speak their mind. They are just here to sort of sound off and have a conversation after all. So they don't like having to restrict themselves. And finally, and this is kind of what it all turns on, you can already see the argument for this, is they're not influencers. There are very few people who really are swayed by them. There are very few large-scale social decisions which turn on what the people within their sphere of influence believe, right? They're not well connected with the powerful, or they're not able to sway so many people that it makes a difference in national level conversations or even local politics. That, for the record, actually, as I say this, I realize this might interact a little bit complicatedly with what I said when this could happen, for instance, on campus, because you can imagine for smaller, say, liberal arts colleges, actually maybe it's not that hard to be someone who could reach so many people that you would sort of not constitute a schmuck in that scenario. So you got to think of this as like definition of a schmuck. Like if you're in a scenario where like the issues being discussed are sufficiently local and you are sufficiently well connected in that community, then even if you are all else equal a schmuck in most scenarios, like relative to that conversation, you're a big boss baby, you're an influencer. But you know, so we can all of us in our lives have within us the schmuck and the boss baby, and you know, that depends on circumstance. But I'm thinking for most of these arguments, like when we're discussing police reform policy or broad social attitudes to gender or what one thinks about the war in Ukraine as someone who's not in Ukraine. You know, all of these things are the kind of things where, like, ultimately, the vast majority of people discussing these things, what they say is just the class of people they can influence is either nobody or very, very small, and certainly not going to be on a scale that makes a difference to how anything goes with those issues. And I think once you think about the logic of that, it introduces a pretty simple to understand, you know, I don't read too much into this. I'm not saying it's a model of it or something, but just a simple sort of like decision scenario for the schmuck reasoning about how they're going to be online. The numbers in the squares are just ordinal rankings. So 4 is the highest, the best, 1 is the lowest, the worst, but like there's nothing cardinal there. That's not telling you about the strength of how good they are. It's just what their order of preference for the outcomes. So the best thing is I don't have to muzzle myself and my team win, and the culture moves in whatever direction we want things to move. But, you know, I understand that, like, the next best would be, okay, I have to make the tiny sacrifice of being a bit disciplined on twitter.com, but still we get police reform. That's still very good. After that, you know, if we're going to lose anyway, I would at least prefer to speak my mind. And so the worst outcome is we lose, and I've been acting like a sort of, you know, a party shill all this time for no good reason. Speaking in the way that the sort of, I don't know, Guardian opinion writers would have me speak or whatever. And, you know, just by examination, just when you think about this, it's kind of obvious that there's a dominance argument here for speaking my mind. Whether we win or we lose, I was always better off speaking my mind. That's always the preferred outcome for me. And so it doesn't matter. You know, I don't need to think about which of those two worlds we're in. Are we in the world where we're winning or in the world where we're losing? I should just speak my mind. Now, I'm sure this argument will seem sophistical for a reason we'll get back to in a second, but this is what I think is actually true. As I think, in fact, we're in a world, this is where the nobody cares what we say element is so important. In fact, we live in a world where whether or not police reform happens is just like totally independent of what I say on Twitter. If I say we should replace the police with slam poets, that is not going to make the slightest difference to the behavior of Keir Starmer or anyone in cabinet or anyone who might vote for Keir Starmer. Like, no one is conditioning their vote or their behavior in Parliament on what Liam posts about about how good it would be if there was slam poets, and instead of police. And so I actually think that, like, despite the fact that this kind of way of viewing the world obviously fails to engage with what the other people are presupposing, I think it's true, and it's kind of obviously true if we're realistic about what's going on. And so the whole notion of instrumental arguments for trying to get me to engage in message discipline to sort of keep my more radical or ultra ideas to myself and speak in a way that's palatable and so on to outsiders, you know, you can't give me an instrumental argument for a situation where I don't have any causal power. It just doesn't make sense. And so my sort of big, you know, in some sense, this is it, really. Like, the point is a simple one. It's just there's a whole class of arguments which are really common in the media. I said they come out the other day, but which really just fail this, like, basic dominance argument. But okay, let's step back a second. So obviously, according to the people who disagree with me, this is not their model. They do not think nobody cares what we say. They're obviously reading about this as if, like, what I tweet, or what, like, as if I should reason about myself that I'm on the left, let's say, so I should care that the way I tweet will influence how people perceive the left, and then that will influence their voting behavior, their cultural behavior, what politicians do or something like this. You know, in some ways it does make a difference, right? So then we're actually in a world where there's a act state dependence, and so me changing which act I choose will move us from one of these worlds to the other. So that's obviously the model they're working with. So I'm not saying they're just sort of seeing a dominant situation and then silly choosing the dominated action. They don't see it that way. But what I do think is that there's sort of like, there is no way we're in this world. And so the real error theory has to be like, what could possibly make you think that the random Twitter followers you interact with, the random Twitter people interact with, like, are have some reason to reason this way, to say like, oh, you're right, yeah, I don't want to put people off voting for left-wing parties on the left or right-wing parties on the right. I better engage in some, I better like cool it and like suppress my real opinions a bit here. Because why would anyone do that? They'd be wild to. Like, that's just a complete waste of their time. So I think the real question is sort of like, why do people think that it will be persuasive to people to say they're in this scenario? Because one thing I haven't said, but which I guarantee if you go through those articles, no one will ever make it explicit that they're presupposing you have this. It's presupposition. It's always implicit that, like, obviously what you do has causal influence on how people perceive the left. And I actually think that in itself is interesting. And I say again the left because that's what the articles I picked, but I think that's interesting because to me that's so obviously false that, like, the very fact that no one will raise it to the level of explicit discussion suggests that they don't, you know, either they haven't thought about it themselves, or if they have thought about it, they realize it wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. So, you know, I really think this is a kind of just like very clearly false model of the vast majority of us schmucks on Twitter, on Facebook, on Tumblr or Mastodon or whatever your drug of choice is. You know, we're really not in this world. We're in this world, and so, you know, that's how you've got to reason about your own contributions if you're going to be vaguely realistic. So what is it that I think leads people to making this mistake? Probably, I think the most basic one is the people who write think pieces are influencers, and they don't realize that the situation of normie schmucks, which is to say their audience, is not their own situation. They just kind of, it's a failure of theory of mind. So it's true, when you're writing articles in The Guardian or the New York Times, or any of those other sources, for example, the Wall Street Journal, for instance, like, yes, when you're a Wall Street Journal author, you should engage in message discipline. You should think about the consequences of your action insofar as you're trying to bring about cultural change on an issue you think is important. Then you've got to be careful. Like, your rhetoric matters. You will be seen as influential because you are, and you'll be seen as representative, whether or not that's fair. You have every reason to do this thing. But when you say that to other people, it doesn't work, because the minute they put the paper down or log off your website or whatever, they're going to go back out into the real world, and they're going to be faced with the fact that all of the things you just said don't apply to them because they're not you. None of them. It's all very well and good for you to talk about how important it is to be credible and sensible and whatnot, but none of that applies to me because it's not important I do anything, because nothing I do is going to make a difference to the kind of cultural battles we care about. So all of this to say, there might be intrinsic reasons for me to talk or behave in a certain way, but the instrumental arguments given about avoiding fracturing the divine left, they only work if you're the kind of person writing the articles. They do not work if you're the kind of person reading the articles. So there's some kind of failure in transmission of context. Again, if I knew argumentation theory, I'm sure I could spell out what I want to say here better. But there's some kind of failure to take into account the difference in context between, like, the context of utterance and the context of what's the word for it? Context where you receive the information. But I mean, there's some kind of failure to account, like, the different situations of the people producing versus the people reading the arguments. So I think that's a pretty significant source for it, and most of it, it's, you know, journalists talk to journalists. So even the people, when they're discussing their articles beforehand, their friends are more likely to be in the boss baby category. And so, you know, they just forget the actual situation of people they're trying to implore to behave a certain way. My second one, though, is meant to My other error theory is that people can sometimes do this. This is just this is a general issue. So I'm at London School of Economics. Many people here work on like how to deal with like collective action problems, right? So what should be my attitude to doing something which produces a little bit of pollution, even where like probably that makes very little difference, but if everyone reasons that way, we get climate disaster, you know, how should we behave? And I think there's just a kind of tendency in all of those discussions. I mean, this is maybe just me revealing I'm not a Kantian, but people do engage in a kind of, they act as if they really are legislating for a kingdom of ends. And so sort of, or maybe it's sort of bad application of evidential decision theory, where they think, well, if I behave this way, that's evidence other people will, or I should behave in the way which would be good if everyone did it, or something like that. And or maybe like I should behave as if the influencer who produced the article I just read is somehow like coordinating us. So now there's a like the Leviathan has said, and we could all go out as if this has been agreed upon. And just like none of those things are true. I mean, it's just this is why I don't find those arguments in responses to collective action problems around climate change very persuasive either. Like the thing that would be good if everyone did it is often not the same as the thing that would be good for you right now, where everyone's not going to do it. In fact, I think that's the situation, given the dominance argument and the fact that it is kind of all else equally good to be able to speak one's mind freely. In fact, I even think I'm not going to go into it here, but if one wants to talk in Q&A, I think there are positive pro-democracy arguments for wanting people to share their wacky opinions, even if that's going to be off-putting. So, you know, I really think this is way off. That, you know, the influencers article can't act like a Leviathan coordinating us all, for the simple reason that everyone, once they stop reading the article, will be faced with the very same problem scenario which generated the dominance argument in the first place. So why would they be coordinated by it? There's no police force here to enforce it, as Hobbes would have it. And nor an evidential decision theory is wrong. So don't do that. Oh, it's just a mistake in this case. Like how you behave isn't evidence of how people are going to behave in the sort of decision relevant way. So don't do that. And so, you know, I think that what's going on is there's a kind of existential upshot to this. People need to like really come to terms with who they are and what's going on here, which is you're the lone monk, barely visible there on the shore, and the discourse is the sea, and it's vast and it's terrible, and it doesn't care about you. It could wash you away or leave you there, and it won't care either way. And you can tell it to halt, or you can tell it to keep going, and it will do whatever it's going to do either way. And that's not always an easy thing to recognize, but it doesn't have to be entirely negative. You know, you can see it as something like, I'm just a small part of this like great vast conversation, this great vast collective reasoning process where individually I'm irrelevant, but that doesn't mean there's not some grandeur for the fact that I'm here and part of it. But it does involve giving up delusions of control, delusions of a significance we don't have. And I think that's how you should feel for like the timeline on Twitter. It's something like this sublime experience only owned by Elon Musk. So, you know, my takeaways would be, you know, you got to remember, you are not Leviathan. You're not coordinating into my actions. No one's listening to you. That goes over your schmuck or influencer, in fact. There is no kingdom of ends. Like what you do doesn't legislate for other people. You do not matter. Like there is just that's what you have to accept. There's sort of I'm a nihilist about these things. So adapting slightly the words of Job's wife, you know, if you want to keep your dignity, then just curse God and post. Like you might as well. There's nothing you can do. Just say whatever it is you want to say what's in your heart. Put it out there on the internet, and in the end, it won't really matter, but at least you'll have been true to yourself. For record, she gets struck down shortly after saying this. So, on that note, questions, Q&A. Hi, yeah, that's me. Thank you, everyone.